Hey everybody, welcome to the Sanctus Forum. I'm Michael Stewart Robb, better known as Mike, and this is conspiracy. I wanted to say conspiracy theories, but it's not conspiracy theories, it's conspiracy commentaries, because we're talking about the divine conspiracy and just working through it section by section. And I've got a guest with me today, Aaron Preston, who you probably don't know. That's okay. I'll introduce him in a second. But I did want to say right up front here that this is going to be a little bit different than the normal sort of 10-minute things that I do. You probably have already figured that out. And it'll be a little bit more meandering. We'll just have a conversation and try to go a little bit deeper into just one section. We're just going to stick with these first 11 pages that we've been reading in this book. And because of the length, you may just want to shut off these videos and go over to the podcast. So look for the Sanctus Forum on whatever platform you use, and just find the recording here with Aaron Preston, and just listen into it. I may forget that the cameras are on and they might shut off, or who knows what's going to happen, but just that to keep in mind. Now where we're going here, give you a little bit of a game plan. We're going to start by just sort of talking about what these 11 pages mean in the book. Why did Dallas start the book this way? A book that's about Jesus, about parts of the Bible. Why is he talking about what's happening in the Western world? Second thing we're going to do is we're going to talk a bit about ideas, the role of ideas in society and in our lives. And the third thing is we're going to start to talk about moral knowledge. So if you're interested mostly in the moral knowledge thing, then just fast forward to that. But it is important because today I have Aaron Preston, who's agreed to join me, and he helped write this book, which was Dallas's last philosophical project, The Disappearance of Moral Knowledge, and his name is right here, second spot. Looks like they went alphabetically, so... It's a good book, and worth your time if you're interested in philosophy and ethics and all of that. Dallas is actually a good philosophical writer, which is not something you can always say about modern philosophers. But Aaron helped write that book. He was, and this is the reason why I really wanted to invite him for this here. He was a student of Dallas's at USC in his undergrad and then in his grad school, and did his PhD under Dallas on the history of analytic philosophy, which sounds riveting if you're not in studying philosophy, but for those who are in philosophy, it's a really important work that he did there. And he just kept up with Dallas and knows Dallas's work in philosophy well, and for that reason, I wanted to have him on and to share a little bit more insight about what's happening in these initial pages. So, Aaron, glad you could be here. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here myself.
I've let people know a little bit about who you are and that you knew Dallas personally. And is there something here, since we've got you here, that would give us some insight into who Dallas was as a person? something you remember from your time being with him?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, Dallas was the embodiment of everything he wrote about. He had been practicing the disciplines of spiritual formation that he writes about in his works, and conforming himself to Christ for decades. By the time I met him in the early 1990s, and he immediately stood out to me as being just one of the most remarkable people I've ever met. The combination of intellect and character that Dallas possessed is something I've never seen in anyone else. I mean, there may be a few other people that I've known personally who match him in terms of intellect. There may be a few people I've known who match him in terms of character, but in terms of the combination, it's just absolutely unique, and each one of those dimensions sort of enhanced the other. So the character was amplified by the intellect, and the intellect was amplified by the character, and it really turned him into the most remarkable person I've ever known. And consequently, and that's, you mentioned earlier that I did both my undergrad and my grad studies at USC, and Dallas is the reason why. I met him when I took my first philosophy class, and he got me hooked, and I just knew I had to get more Dallas, as much Dallas as possible. So
yeah,
that's why I stayed there and went back there.
yeah. I think Dallas Willard is the kind of person where if he hooks you just a little bit, then the only way you're ever going to get out of that is by going deeper in and really figuring out what makes him think and act as he does.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of depth there. He's I've been studying him for many years now, and there's always more to find. All that to say, I'm not out yet. I'm able to sort of I read the things now I find that Dallas read and that inspired him, and I think that helps me.
Yeah, same here. I'm not out of Dallas either. I continue to learn more from him. Most of his works repay rereading. You see new things in them that you didn't see. This is true of his academic work as well as his popular work.
Yeah.
And then, of course, reading the things he read and that inspired him. That's a list so long. Most people would not be able to make it through in a lifetime, and I know I never will.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
You probably know he had an entire house gutted to hold his library, and I saw that library, and let me tell you, that's the point where I gave up hope.
Yeah, I saw the library too. And I'll actually put a picture on the screen here if you're watching. Now this is where watching actually is advantageous, but I took a couple pictures there, and you can get a small glimpse of what this house, which only housed books, was like. All right, the first thing I want to talk with you about, Aaron, is just these first 11 pages. The overarching title is Life in the Dark, and Dallas is writing these in 1997, so right before the book is published. Most of the chapters are already done, and he inserts this bit into the front of it. And I think this section shocks a lot of people when they get to it, because they weren't expecting this, perhaps. Maybe they were hoping for it, but they weren't maybe expecting that Dallas would start here. So what do you think he's doing here? Why in a book about Jesus, about the gospel, kind of a religious book, one that the publisher is calling Christian spirituality, why this kind of thing? What do you think he's up to?
Well, I think you have to start with an understanding that Dallas did not see religion as something to be compartmentalized in one little section of a person's life. He didn't see it as something that was only a matter of private commitment. He saw it as sort of God's organic gesture to humanity that was supposed to be all-encompassing and all-embracing. He believes that the Christian religious and ethical framework is supposed to be a foundation for human life generally. And that means both individual human life and corporate human life. He thought that what Jesus was trying to teach us was how to live life in a way that could shape all the dimensions of human life. And so he starts off with this story about the pilot flying upside down and crashing, not knowing which way is up or which way is down, and using that as an illustration of contemporary Western society, of having no moral compass, really. No, we've lost our moral bearings. We don't know how to properly direct and pilot our lives, both individually and corporately or as a society. And Jesus then is going to be presented, as the book unfolds, as the person who is uniquely capable of resetting our instruments, as it were, of putting us on the right sort of moral bearing for individual and corporate life. So that's why he opens the book the way he does, with this commentary on where Western society is right now, and sort of being morally stumbling around in the darkness. That kind of thing.
This is a mode of Dallas's writing and thinking which I don't think a lot of people know about. So some of the philosophy can be rather technical. He's diving deep into issues of metaphysics, epistemology. And then you've got the sort of the Dallas with the Bible in his hand, kind of teaching people who want to know about the Bible, about Jesus. And then there's this sort of, there are a few things out there where he's doing kind of social commentary. And a lot of it had to do with the university, place of the university in human life. There's this article, I'm sure you've read it, on the unhinging of the American mind, where he's talking about Derrida. You know it, yeah?
Yes, I have read that. I can't claim that I can call specific themes to mind, but
don't worry. I mean, that's something that you can read of his in this sort of genre. And he would often teach. He actually was invited to mostly Christian universities and meetings of university professors or presidents, and talking about the situation of the university in American culture. And I think it's something that maybe bears a little that I wish was more well known about him, because it is some really good observations. Yeah,
it's an important theme for Dallas. And the book you held up earlier, The Disappearance of Moral Knowledge, the first chapter of that book does contain an extended discussion of precisely that set of issues.
Yeah. We were talking before about how in Germany you still have religious education as a requirement in schools, all the way through high school, secondary education. And if you're a part of the Roman Catholic Church, you get a Roman Catholic religious education, and if you're a part of the Protestant Church, you get a Protestant one, and if you're a part of neither of them, then they call your course of studies ethics. And so there's, I think you probably could find an ethics course in a high school in America. It would certainly be optional. And yeah, you wouldn't find a religious education course, certainly nothing that was required. But there's a bit of a sense here that we kind of need ethics. We need that's at least maybe the basic bit that you could say about these courses is the sense of there's a need to talk about this stuff.
Well, that's very promising. It sounds like in your neck of the woods, folks are maybe a step ahead of where we are here in the U.S. right now. I
don't know. I think obviously knowledge is always going to be better than ignorance. And so, they're doing something. Let's keep it there. So I think that's one thing when you read these first pages here in this book, that may be a little strange if you're reading it as coming from a European context, or if you're reading it and perhaps a bit younger. So Aaron and I are kind of Gen X. I'm probably the baby of Gen X generation, and Pearl Jam was on the radio when we were young. But then kind of below us, there is a little bit different mentality, and at least in the United States, and here too to some degree. But let's save that for later then. Good deal?
Sure.
Let's talk about ideas now. That's kind of floating in the background of this section, and I want to read you something to begin with, which Dallas has to say about ideas, and then we can use that as a basis to talk about this here. This is out of Renovation of the Heart, one of his other books, and it's out of a chapter on the mind, and he's going to say that, if you want to change who you are, one of the things you need to work on is your mind. And he's going to say that, here, I'll start reading a little bit earlier where he says, the realm of thought involves four main factors. These are ideas, images, information, and our ability to think. The ability to think, he means reason, really, is what he means there. Aaron, you know that. But I find very interesting here what he writes about ideas, and so I'll read just a paragraph, and if you get this out yourself, you can read a little bit more and have a little bit more context for it. But ready, Aaron?
Sure.
Okay. Ideas are very general models of or assumptions about reality. They are patterns of interpretation, historically developed and socially shared. They sometimes are involved with beliefs, but are much more than belief and do not depend upon it. They are ways of thinking about and interpreting things. They are so pervasive and essential to how we think about and how we approach life that we often do not even know they are there or understand when and how they are at work. Our idea system is a cultural artifact, growing up with us from earliest childhood out of the teachings, expectations, and observable behaviors of family and community. Yeah, then he goes on to say some other really interesting things, such as, for example, that people who refer to themselves as practical and men of action are those who are often most in the grip of ideas, right? So, Aaron, you're a philosopher. Not too many people earn their money as a philosopher. So you're working with ideas all the time.
True.
And then and then universities too are kind of idea factories, churning out things, helping students grapple with ideas.
That's the thought, at least. That's what we try to do.
I think one of the ways of interpreting human life in our day that's gained a bit more attraction is this idea that we're products of sort of a social context. So
Right.
social context or family, that kind of the psychological approach, tell me about the relationship to your father and I'll tell you about you.
Yeah.
Rather than, well, maybe these people who act this certain way are consuming a certain type of ideas versus this other group who actually are working on a different set of ideas.
Sure. Okay, so a couple of different points I want to make related to all of that. So probably it would be useful if we started by thinking about the relationship between ideas, beliefs, and actions.
Okay.
So one of the things that Dallas says in the passage you read is that ideas are not beliefs, and so this is correct, right? So ideas are just ways of thinking about things. You can think about different possibilities of the way things might be, the way different parts of the world might be. You can entertain ideas without being committed to any one of them.
Right.
Right? Belief, what distinguishes a mere idea from a belief is that belief is an attitude of commitment that we have to an idea. When we accept an idea as a true representation of the way reality is, that's when we believe it.
We're ready to act.
And that's right. And that's why belief brings along with it a readiness to act as if some idea, the one you're believing in, was true.
Yeah. This is it. So sorry, can I insert here? That reminds me of a distinction Dallas made in. So a lot of folks believe that human beings are no more than just a pile of molecules with some electrical current running through them. But they don't treat human beings in that respect. They don't treat their family members like that. And so Dallas called attention to the fact that their beliefs are actually different than the ideas that govern their understanding of the world, right? So you can kind of, in that case, be thankful that these people aren't sort of living up to their ideas.
Right. So yeah, Dallas would often characterize belief as just a matter of being ready to act as if some set of ideas were true.
Right.
And I myself, I think there's a little more to belief than that. I think there's this idea of acceptance or assent or commitment.
Okay.
I think that's psychologically prior. And I don't think Dallas would have denied that, but he was in his own teachings far more interested in the practical import of belief. So one of the things you were sort of asking about there with regard to the passage is, why are beliefs important? Or so why are ideas important?
Yeah.
And I think that the most straightforward answer that can be given here from a Willardian perspective is that ideas can show up as the content of beliefs, and when they do, they guide our actions, both as individuals and as communities of people. When we share the same beliefs, then to an extent, and I suppose you might say to the exact extent that we actually share beliefs, we are also prepared to act in the same ways.
Yeah. Yeah, isn't it like it shows human limitation in the respect that we have to guide our life based upon the ideas that are available to us at this present moment.
That's right.
So if we haven't read that self-help book that would really turn our life around, then we aren't helped.
Right. I mean, it's I don't know, like struggling with a math problem, maybe, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you're trying to find the solution to a math problem, but you're not able to bring the right ideas to bear
Yeah.
on the problem, then you're not going to solve it.
Yeah.
And you've got to get the right idea in mind, and then that idea will provide a template for action.
Yeah. Let's talk about this bit that he says here. I think it's also in this. That even though they are pervasive and essential to how we think about and approach life, we often do not even know they are there or understand when and how they're at work. So some of the ideas at the beginning of Divine Conspiracy, I mean, these sort of big ideas he's talking about, he's trying to say those are things that are so deep now in American or perhaps Western society that you don't have to, people don't really think about them, or they certainly aren't defending them, or they have to, work on it constantly to sort of keep this idea before them.
Right. So, Dallas, I think it's worth stating that Dallas did think that it was possible for individuals to transcend the sets of ideas that they inherited from culture, and to penetrate through to reality and truth on their own. However, he thought that took a lot of discipline, and you had to have a certain kind of character and a certain kind of commitment in order to pull that off. And of course, that's not possible until you reach a certain level of maturity or development as a human being. And so the default position for human knowledge acquisition is to operate on the basis of authority. You inherit your ways of thinking, your ideas, and your accepted ideas, and so your beliefs. You inherit them from the authorities in your life, including parents, other members of your community who are regarded as authoritative, political leaders sometimes, teachers, professors, so on and so forth. And we generally accept the ideas that are handed down to us without scrutinizing them in the way that a philosopher might.
Mm-hmm.
And we simply start to employ the ideas as if they were accurate or true. And we from the point we start doing that, we just take it for granted. And they operate as assumptions that have usually never been examined in any sort of careful way.
So it's interesting. You're working at a university, and typically, university education is a time when professors and kind of that Gandalf sort of style help students look at the authority structures, things that they came into the university with, and say, well, is this accurate? Is this in line with what humanity has learned over the years? But Dallas, in these pages, is critiquing the university I guess in a sense for not doing their job, or perhaps for kind of undermining the students to such a degree that they walk out and don't really know what to think.
Yes. Yeah. There's a lot I could say about that. I don't know how deep you want me to go into these waters.
I think I want to just keep thinking about how important it is for us as young people. You know, you and I aren't exactly young people anymore, but when we're young, we're thinking about the world. Obviously, we're thinking about, you know, what we grew up with, and there are different voices. There are professors. If we're at university, there are people we're reading. There are artists. And actually, interestingly, Dallas said that artists are almost the only group that young people don't question at all, who they don't approach skeptically. Professors are all kind of skeptically, sort of like, okay, this guy does have something to say to me, but I need to kind of be careful.
Yeah.
But these what we get during that period of our life is very important for our intellectual formation. I mean, you don't usually see 50-year-olds kind of rethinking their...
Right. It takes a lot to shake someone up to that point where they'll rethink things from the foundations.
Yeah.
Once those foundations have been laid, and so that is a very critical period in life, and of course that's often right about the time when young people are going to the universities.
Yeah.
And you know, Dallas's critique of the university, there's a sort of vision for education in the West that goes all the way back to Plato.
Yeah.
And it has to do with the rational pursuit of knowledge of the good, with the anticipation that once that knowledge is achieved, you'll put it into practice. So this is, you might say, a quest for moral knowledge. And the idea is we want to know how to live our lives the right way, both as individuals and as a society. And this is what, say, Plato's Republic, for example, is all about.
Mm-hmm.
And that has been the guiding vision of higher education for most of Western history. But in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, for a variety of reasons, the universities kind of gave up on the idea of moral knowledge that could be taught with the same kind of authority that, say, mathematics or biology could be taught. And now we're in a situation where we've been living with that abandonment of the idea of moral knowledge for so long that it seems normal. It seems like the normal state of affairs, and folks who are confident about moral opinions are usually taken to be dogmatists or of one form or another, and frankly, often they are. But the idea here is that the sort of roots of Western civilization involve the hope and the belief that something more than dogmatism is possible, that you could actually have moral knowledge.
Yeah. Let's use that as a stepping grounds to our third topic here. You've already mentioned it here about moral knowledge. And so in these chapters, in these pages, that's one of the sort of ideas that he's working with. Why don't you give me a brief summary of what he was thinking there. Moral knowledge disappeared. And then maybe a little bit about, this was written in 1997. We're recording this in 2021. Maybe what's changed since then?
Yeah, so the disappearance of moral knowledge, which is the title of the book you held up earlier.
Right, that's this one here, yeah?
Yeah. So, but it's the core idea is already present here in the Divine Conspiracy.
Yeah.
Right? So these early pages of the book are essentially about the same phenomenon that entire book is about. The disappearance of moral knowledge in Dallas's mind was a cultural phenomenon or a social phenomenon. It was a matter of the governing institutions and authorities of Western culture essentially losing faith in the idea of the very possibility of moral knowledge, just as I was describing a few moments ago with regard to the university. But from the university, this loss of faith, you might say, in the possibility of moral knowledge spread to other institutions, government, the professions, and so on. And the resulting cultural situation is one in which a person who wanted to know how to live their life the right way would not easily be able to find answers that were widely regarded as being accurate answers.
Yeah.
The same way, go ahead.
Yeah, let's try to. So, if you wanted to fix your car, you could find the knowledge out there to fix it. Really, doesn't matter what car you have. We've got that. It's probably not that difficult to find. So what Dallas is saying here is, if you want to be a good person, and you want that to be based on the way things really are, then socially and at the university level, nobody can really help you.
That's right. If you want to be a good mechanic, we've got the knowledge for you.
Right.
We know where to go to get that knowledge. From official training programs to YouTube videos. Knowledge is in abundance. But if you want to know how to be a good person, if you want to know how to live your life the right way, you're not going to find, there may be lots of people out there sharing their views, but these are all going to be regarded as subjective opinions. And there's not going to be anything that's really regarded as authoritative knowledge.
Right.
Where, just like there's a right and a wrong way to repair an engine, there's a right and a wrong way to approach the moral life. That's not how we think about it anymore. But that's how we thought about it prior to the 20th century.
It's interesting, especially for Americans, and perhaps, each European country could be a little bit different here, but we sort of are so used to there not being any authoritative ethical teaching in our cultures that we forget that 120 years ago there was. That people just assumed, just as we assume, we can figure out how to fix this car. People assumed, we can figure out how to fix this moral life that I have. Because they're people that are authorities on this subject.
Right. And, that's not to say that it that there weren't disagreements. That's not to say that there weren't puzzles sometimes, but you've got disagreements and puzzles about how to interpret quantum mechanics, and that doesn't make us think there isn't a true answer to be found. But for some reason our cultural attitude toward the possibility of moral knowledge has shifted, And that's what Dallas is referring to
Right.
when he talks about the disappearance of moral knowledge. Now, go ahead.
No, maybe you were going to go there, but in preparation for this talk, you said that that you and even Dallas himself, at the end of his life, was having some difficulty convincing students. So he's teaching, at the end of his life, he's teaching millennials. He taught like all generations. He taught the baby boomers in the 60s, and he taught Gen X, and he taught millennials, and but the millennials then in his classes, and you teach millennials now, and we're having some difficulty grasping the kind of the edge of the problem.
That's right, and I think that has to do with a certain cultural changes that have occurred in conjunction with these generational changes. So let me just lay out a few big things that happened in the 20th century that really provided the background to what Dallas took himself to be responding to in terms of the disappearance of moral knowledge. And then I'll say a little bit about what changed as we sort of shifted from, the 1990s to the early 2000s,
right.
And that I think caused some of this difficulty in understanding the problem that Dallas is trying to identify and articulate. So going back to the 1930s, there was a kind of a sea change at that point in the way American universities, at the very least, approached the idea of moral knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Until the end of the 1800s, American universities basically accepted the idea that there was moral knowledge and that it could be communicated and taught, and they organized their curricula around this idea, and made moral education the sort of overarching goal of a university education. But by the time we get to the 1930s, this had all changed, and a lot of this has to do with the rise of the sciences, and not only the theoretical challenges that some of the findings of some of the sciences posed to traditional religious and moral views, but also practically. I mean, many of these new scientific disciplines obviously had or held within their knowledge the possibility of great practical benefits to human beings. I mean, the speed at which we've developed vaccines for COVID, for example, over the last year. I mean, prior to the advent of modern science, this would not have been possible, and we would have been suffering for generations, possibly, with bouts of COVID. So people wanted the practical benefits of the sciences in the form of medicines and cures of various sorts, as well as useful technologies of various sorts. And so there was a kind of a market demand placed on the university to provide more scientifically trained people. And then the question became, well, how do you make room for that in the curriculum? And what ended up happening after a lot of attempts to sort of do everything is that the aim of moral education got dropped by the wayside, and scientific training took over. And by the 1930s, the emerging scientific worldview had articulated itself in the form of what came to be known as the fact-value distinction. The idea that the only kinds of facts there are empirical, scientifically discoverable facts. And values are just subjective feelings.
Values aren't facts.
And they're not facts at all.
Yeah.
And therefore, there's nothing in the realm of value to be known or to be taught.
Yeah.
And this took hold in the universities and had various sorts of manifestations. There's a whole school of thought in philosophy itself that developed around this idea. But the more important manifestation of this idea was the curricular
Yeah.
manifestation, where the old ideal of moral education, which had already been demoted from the overarching sort of central aim of higher education, had been shuffled off to the periphery in the form of general education programs.
Yeah.
But from there, it got further relegated to arts and humanities disciplines that conceived of themselves as providing an emotionally based moral education.
Yeah.
The way to teach people the difference between right and wrong was to expose them to great works of art and literature, where they might find welling up within themselves the appropriate kinds of emotions
Yeah.
of either approval or disapproval that would fund the moral life.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this emotivist approach to moral education persisted for many decades.
Yeah.
And ultimately, it failed terribly because while it's true that emotions probably do play a really important role in human moral psychology, and Plato was perfectly aware of this.
That's interesting. You bring up Plato. I mean, Plato's got this very classic psychology of moving from the belly to the chest to the head, and the head is for him reason, rationality, and then your desires and your sense of honor and sense of anger were sort of lower down, ideally.
Right. Well, Plato does include all of this in the soul. Their bodily manifestations show up in different locations, but at the end of the day, logos or reason, thumos, or it's difficult to translate this term. It's literally heart, but often gets translated spirit or emotion. My own view is that it's a lot like what we think of as conscience, where the conscience is a set of moral emotions. The fundamental moral emotion for Plato, I think, is a sort of righteous indignation, a kind of anger,
zeal,
kind of anger. Yeah, but one that for him almost shows up as a kind of anger, I think, at wrongdoing. But there's more to thumos than that. And then you've got epithumia, the appetites, lusts, desires. And these are all ultimately parts of the soul for Plato, and the idea was they need to be properly organized and integrated with one another in a hierarchical fashion where reason is in charge of the rest. And what happens in the 20th century is basically we are told that reason has no role in the moral life. Only the emotions do. And so now there's nothing in you that can govern emotion on the basis of factual connection with reality. And so there are in fact no standards for what you ought to feel.
You just have greater and lesser emotions or feelings toward something, and that's
And I mean, this Bertrand Russell, who is often regarded as the greatest English language philosopher of the 20th century, was an early adopter of this emotivist perspective. And in the mid 1930s, he started sort of advocating for this emotivist view very strongly, saying there's really nothing more to moral judgment than something like aesthetic taste. There's nothing more to declaring something good or bad than saying I like oysters or I don't like oysters. But then fast forward into the 1940s and 50s and 60s, basically, post World War II, post Holocaust,
Right.
and Russell has come to see the weakness of this view, and
Okay.
he says, even though I cannot accept a more robust moral theory than this emotivist view, it seems to me like there must be something more to say about the wrongness of cruelty than just that I don't like it. So this is the weakness of the emotivist view. What do you do when a person's emotions are such that they want to harm other people? When they want to be cruel to other people, to say that's bad, that's wrong, is just to say I don't like what you're doing,
Yeah.
but that doesn't provide a reason for them not to like what they're doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this is the problem. And as things developed in the universities, this sort of idealistic, um, aesthetic based approach to moral education.
I should add, I mean, this was taken very seriously.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, this is not like something that a couple of crackpot professors thought up. This was thought to be, to be very helpful for humanity to learn this
Right.
about itself.
Right. And it manifests in many different ways. Freudian psychology is, for example, another way this manifested. It's your fundamental drives that are the real you.
Yeah.
It's bound up with ideals about authenticity.
Yeah.
For example, be true to your emotions, be true to your feelings, and that's the real you, that's the true you. And somehow, if you let yourself be that person, you will be a good person.
Yeah.
And you kind of depends on what kinds of emotions you have. And I think even the best of us have to admit that sometimes, if there are certain emotional states we find ourselves in where if we express them with authenticity, it probably would be right to put us in jail afterward. Right? So I mean, not all emotions are good in that way. They need regulation. Plato knew that, and pretty much every major thinker in the Western tradition knew that up until we got to the 20th century.
Yeah.
So in any case, you've got this transition in the university curriculum toward this emotivist view. Moral education is handed over to the arts and the humanities. Before long, you've got the arts and the humanities and some of the social sciences, frankly, as well, being infiltrated with certain forms of philosophical thought that come from mainly 20th century European thinkers.
Can you name that in case somebody wants to look it up?
Sure. So you've got
Just quickly.
you've got the critical theorists, the Frankfurt School and their sort of later generations of thinkers coming out of that tradition. You've got the kinds of thinkers that sometimes get labeled postmodern. Derrida,
Post-structuralists
is one.
Yeah.
And Foucault, a big one, right? And these folks tend to be focused on what they perceive to be a certain sort of moral mission, mission of liberation, right? And liberation from what? Well, liberation essentially, I mean, this is at the heart of all this is a sort of relativistic view that sees morality as a cultural construct, which then gets, I'm kind of, to a certain extent aligns with that passage you were reading from Dallas from earlier, right? That we inherit our ideas, and there is truth to that. But these folks tended to reject any sort of rational ability that would allow us to critique our inherited ideas in ways that would allow us to replace them with genuinely true ideas. It was all cultural construction, one way or another. And truth was either inaccessible or perhaps non-existent, in at least in these areas. So the idea then is that this wave of relativistic thinking begins to infiltrate the university through the arts and the humanities, who had been entrusted with moral education. And before long, you end up with the situation that, say, Alan Bloom is discussing in his book, The Closing of the American Mind, back in the mid-1980s, where he's talking about how the undergraduate population in the United States, and specifically his institution, seemed to, you said there was one thing you can count on every undergraduate believing when they come to college, and that is there is no moral truth. It's all relative, right? And this is really the milieu in which Dallas started to worry over the disappearance of moral knowledge. Right? So this idea that, well, no one's got any moral knowledge. It's all just subjective opinion. You can't really judge others. Everyone has their own views, and you just sort of adopt a live and let live perspective because there's no rational basis on which to criticize anybody else. And so there you go. And you know, this is the cultural result at a more fine-grained level of the disappearance of moral knowledge from our cultural institutions back in the earlier part of the 20th century. And this is really, I think, what Dallas had most in mind when he was talking about the disappearance of moral knowledge. But he did note in the book, The Disappearance of Moral Knowledge, and in some of his other writings, that there was also this tendency, because the moral domain really is a part of human life. It really is a part of reality, and it will not go away, and we need to attend to it somehow. He observed that morality, in a more traditional sense, tended to sneak back in the form of dogmatically held views that asserted themselves in the form of what's sometimes called political correctness. Right, so the idea here is that there would be, we're not willing to put our moral beliefs on the table and argue for them as possible items of knowledge. We don't believe that's possible at all. But because we need to have some framework of right and wrong in order to guide human life.
We need to get up in the morning and do something.
Right. And we need to find ways of cooperating with one another when we're at work. Right. And so there will be systems of right and wrong that are enforced in our public dealings with one another. The question is going to be, are those going to be enforced as items of knowledge, or are they going to be enforced as sort of dogmatic assumptions that are, if you disagree with them or want to question them, then you will simply be mobbed with disapproval, rather than people saying, well, no, let's think about this and see who's in the right. Right. So
there are different, I mean, you mentioned political correctness as one route that this takes, but there are different kinds of mobs, are there not, who will, in a sense, use whatever power or authority they have to try to, convince, or even if they can't convince, to at least direct public policy in their direction.
To force and cajole. Yeah. So, yes. And now talking a little bit about the change that's happened, I think that the reason Dallas, in his last year or so of teaching, was having difficulty communicating the problem of the disappearance of moral knowledge in a convincing way, is that these more dogmatic ways of approaching moral matters grew in popularity beginning around the turn of the millennium, let's say.
Yeah.
As we leave the 1900s behind and move on to the 2000s, you see an increasing readiness on the part of especially younger people to act as if they were in possession of moral knowledge
Yeah.
and assert their views with the kind of authority and self-assurance that would be legitimate only if they were genuine items of moral knowledge.
This is to insert here. This is different from when you and I were in high school or in university, where you had people who, would kind of spend their life on drugs, and then you had people who wanted to be, valedictorian, or they wanted to do well, they wanted to volunteer their time, and you kind of had to look at both of those as just like, well, they're just living their lives, and kind of just, you try to be friends with them, but that was sort of the expectation. And but it's not like that.
Right. So I mean, you might say that you and I grew up in an ethos of sort of highly tolerant relativism, right? Where the idea was, if there was a sort of presupposed ethic underneath it all, it was an ethic of tolerance. But what you see in more recent generations of college students, beginning sometime in the 2000s, it seems to me, is a willingness to be intolerant toward certain sets of views, certain kinds of actions, many of them speech acts or speech actions, or just actions of speech, I should say, not speech acts in the technical philosophical sense, but and I mean, the most obvious manifestation of this, to my mind, is the phenomenon of what we sometimes call Wokism here in the United States. And along with that is the phenomenon of cancel culture, where there's a certain set of moral sensibilities, and this is usually associated with far left progressive moral sensibilities. And the idea is we are in possession of moral knowledge. We know what's right and what's wrong, and we are not going to stand for what we believe to be wrong. And so, if you say the wrong thing, do the wrong thing, we will form a mob, online or however else, and we will attack you. And
you'd never call it a mob, but you'd.
I mean, the term witch hunt has been used to describe these kinds of events. The term Twitter mob has been used for these kinds of things. But cancel culture. But it's important to see that this is something that happens both on the left and the right. The phenomenon,
which is interesting, because it's kind of a democratic process, isn't it? I mean, you're getting voters, in a sense, for a particular issue.
How many people can you get to join your mob, right? I mean, that matters.
Your constituency or your
right. But over on the right, you've got the phenomenon of Trumpism. And so much that has gone along with that, especially over the last year, with the whole, sort of conspiracy theory about the, stealing the election, and the whole QAnon conspiracy theory, and you again have a group of people with radically different moral sensibilities than the woke. Who are convinced that they are in possession of the truth, including the moral truth about certain matters. and they are not going to stand for the way other people are
Right.
disregarding that
Right.
truth, and they went as far as, storming the Capitol of the U.S. Capitol
Right.
building. Um,
And
so
as listening to you to sort of describe what are often regarded as extremes and often I think rightly regarded as extremes, but then you do have sort of shades away from that extreme or those sort of poles,
mhm,
and those people who perhaps would never storm the Capitol or wouldn't go to the extent of trying to form a mob, but they might join it or something like that.
mhm, mhm.
They feel that sense of moral responsibility. Let's call it
Mhm.
responsibility. In maybe not to the same extent as the two poles, but there's an ethos that's been created here,
Yes.
and it's, I think, in America increasingly difficult not to sort of be on one or the other side of it.
I think that's true for those of us who try to hold some middle ground. What ends up happening is you get attacked by both sides.
There you
So
go. Yeah.
that's a lot of fun. Um, yeah, and I mean, that's my own experience.
Right.
I've tried to, on certain issues, I am more in alignment with one side, and on others more in alignment with the other. And but in neither case do I feel like the extreme views are correct, and what ends up happening is you just take flack all around. But that's okay. I mean, if you take Jesus' teaching seriously, you'll be prepared for this sort of thing. You'll be expecting it, right?
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
So, um, but to get back to the idea of what changed, right? I mean, Dallas is here finally at the end of this long process of thought and writing, toward the end of his life. Teaching this material in 2011, 2012, and the students are going, I don't think I see the problem.
Hmm.
And then I myself had uh, the pleasure of teaching a graduate seminar at a Canadian university a couple of years ago on the disappearance of moral knowledge. We read a lot of that text
Mm-hmm.
in addition to other things, and there were some of the students who were on board with it, and others who were more skeptical. Has Willard identified a real problem here?
Mm-hmm.
And it struck me at that point that, well, things have changed since Dallas started working on this
Yeah.
project back in the late 90s. And one of the things that's changed is folks have gotten a lot more confident about what they perceive to be moral knowledge.
Mm.
And so now we're in a position where people may be less inclined to believe that moral knowledge has disappeared,
Yeah.
even though it has. And in fact, these positions that we see developing on the left and the right are, I believe, best explained as responses to the disappearance of moral
Hmm.
knowledge.
Hmm.
When you have this vacuum open up, there need to be answers
Yeah.
to the questions about how to live human life.
Yeah.
And if our authoritative institutions, which historically were responsible for presenting carefully formulated and well-reasoned views about how to live human life,
Yeah.
which stood a chance of being true
Yeah.
and therefore being actual knowledge. When those institutions back away from that calling and say, we've got no answers for you, human beings are going to find answers elsewhere.
Yeah.
And they will often find answers that are less well worked out, less credible, less well founded than
Yeah.
the ones that would have been produced had we taken the project of moral knowledge more seriously in the university, say,
Yeah.
throughout the 20th century.
Yeah. Yeah. Because at the end of the day, we've got to do something,
Right.
and we got problems.
Right.
We're not okay just as we are. So if we need some help, and
Right.
and people
Right.
people are ready to step up and help
Hmm.
us.
Well, yeah. And sometimes the need for action becomes desperate, genuinely
Yeah.
desperate.
Yeah.
And you've got to do something.
Yeah.
And the only question is, what are you going to do, and on what basis? And getting back to some issues that we were talking about earlier, if you've got the wrong ideas in mind when you strike out to do something, your actions will be wrong.
Yeah.
And you're even though you're intending to do good, you might actually end up doing more harm than good.
Yeah.
You might end up creating more problems than solving problems.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually what's happening
Yeah.
right now. And it really it sort of emanates from, well, the concept of knowledge involves this idea not only of acquiring truth, but acquiring truth on sort of a reasonable basis. I mean, Dallas used to put it like this, that knowledge is the ability to represent something as it is on an appropriate basis of thought and or experience.
Yeah.
And what we have now are people who are not willing or not able to attend to that demand that our claims to knowledge be based on an adequate basis or an appropriate basis of thought and experience.
Yeah.
So the evidentiary basis, the rational basis of these views is lacking. And that's why I think they're better characterized as dogmatic systems of belief
Mm-hmm.
rather than actual bodies of moral knowledge.
Yeah. Thanks, Aaron, for being with us.
It's my pleasure, Mike.
Talking.
It's been great.
Talking about this. Don't go out and buy this book unless you're really interested in philosophy and the sorts of things we've been talking about at the end of this podcast. Sorry, for those of you who are just listening, I'm holding up the book, The Disappearance of Moral Knowledge. It's a tough book, but it's a good book if you're into that sort of thing. But Aaron, is there any sort of parting word for us? Perhaps something that you would always like to tell your students?
Sure. Yeah. It's not something I always say directly to the students, but I do hope that all my students take this sensibility away from my classes, and it's something that that I think we all took away from Dallas's classes as well, and that is this idea that well, look, if your behavior matters, then your beliefs matter. And if your beliefs matter, then truth in ideas matter. And if that matters, then we have a duty to try to make sure that we have the best and most accurate beliefs that we can come by. And that means we've got to pay a lot of attention to the bases for our beliefs, and we have to do a lot of exploration and listening and fair-minded consideration of the different possibilities for belief that there are. And only once you've gone through all of that and have come to a settled, well-founded opinion about what the truth is, are you in a position where you can present your views as knowledge.
Thanks, Aaron.
My pleasure.
So we're at the end of this more podcast-like version of the conspiracy commentaries, and I hope that Aaron is not the last guest. Hopefully we haven't intimidated anybody else that I was hoping to ask. But do check back for this. I'm going to try to grab some people over here in Europe and some people that knew Dallas personally or worked with his books. Well, all over the world, people like Aaron. So look into that. They'll be a bit longer than the normal ones. And yeah, thanks for liking this, subscribing. Head on over to Sanctus.Institute to sign up for our newsletter. And yeah, if there are any questions you have upcoming here about the book, let us know at info@sanctus.institute or something. If I can't answer it, then I don't know. We'll write to Aaron and see if he knows, or somebody else. We'll get them as a guest here. So anyway, see you next time, and until then. All right. That's a wrap.
All right. Well, hopefully you can edit, make something coherent and manageable in terms of time.
Yeah, I'm not the biggest editor. See, look, this is still running. So
It's a good sign.
It's a good sign.